Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If this is your first time listening in, welcome. We're happy to have you join us. The purpose of this podcast is to provide some valuable content for people who are interested in Lean and Six Sigma and continuous improvement. So our mission here is really simple, to improve companies and to improve careers through continuous improvement. We're here to share inspiring stories and journeys from individuals who have embarked on this path of continuous improvement. We hope that through these interviews with leaders and innovators and change makers, we're exploring the sparks that ignite these transformative journeys, both within organizations and also in personal and career growth. So whether you're starting out or looking to take your improvement efforts to the next level, we're here to guide, inspire, and empower you. We know that the path to improvement can be lonely sometimes. You might feel like you're trying to push an improvement agenda in an organization that just wants to keep doing things the same old way. So hopefully hearing some of these stories from people who face similar challenges can give you a little extra motivation to keep moving forward. I'm your host, Keith Norris, and our guest today is Randy Kesterson. Randy is a transformational operations leader with over 20 years experience driving strategic change across global manufacturing and supply chain organizations. He's led major turnarounds for Fortune 100 companies and private equity firms with deep expertise in lean, mergers and acquisition integration, operational excellence. He's a certified executive coach and published author. Randy is known for blending strategic vision with hands-on execution. Thanks so much for joining us here today, Randy.
Thanks, Keith. I enjoy being here today. Appreciate for you inviting me.
Awesome. So one of the things that I always like to do is just start this introduction with how you got started in this thing that we call continuous improvement or lean or whatever flavor it is. But if you can remember back to your first introduction to this, you've obviously made it a career, but what was the first introduction for you?
I think I'm the oldest living person still practicing lean, so I'll think back to when it all began. So I started as a manufacturing engineer when I got out of college at John Deere and doing traditional manufacturing and industrial engineering kind of things. And then I was assigned to a project. It was called Group Technology, and we were moving our functional departments into manufacturing cells. And so this started in 1979, 1980, that time frame. And it was before the term lean had even been coined. So I tell people I was doing lean before lean was even a thing. But it worked out very well. We grouped machines various machines into manufacturing cells, accomplished single part, single piece flow, reduced the cost of the components, improved the quality, and it was a fantastic experience. And so that, for me, that was really what got me started with lean. I didn't know what to call it for a few years, but I guess you could call it continuous improvement at that point in time.
And that was at John Deere, did you say? Excellent. The company that you have now is a consulting firm, the Kesterson Group. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. If my career, I think of it as a pie diagram. 2/3 has been in leadership roles, mostly aerospace and defense, manufacturing, heavy industry. The 1/3 is consulting, advisory work, executive coaching, and so forth. But I think the common denominator for my entire career has been, transformation and change and improving the way companies and people work. So very much aligned to your podcast theme.
Wonderful, wonderful. So are there some maybe milestones along your career journey from that first exposure to an initiative or a project there inside John Deere? When you left John Deere, for example, where did you go to next? What kind of work did you do after that?
So I had been at John Deere for about 4 years. They had a huge layoff, and in retrospect, it impacted maybe 1/3 of the corporation. Didn't know it at the time, but it was a big downturn in the ag market. And I ended up in a small company in upstate New York, privately held, run by a PhD economist. And so I went from a business with a lot of organized manufacturing systems and so forth, with 300 people in my department, to a company with 60 people with the task of modernizing and improving this company so we could grow it pretty aggressively. So I went into that environment, and in that case, the requirement was to bring in an ERP system, modernize the company, really prepare it for some pretty dramatic growth that turned out to be about 20x over the years. So, but entirely different experience, entirely different exposure to what continuous improvement was all about. The common denominator there was our biggest customer was General Electric gas turbine, and we were making these large hydraulic valves and actuators, and Jack Welch was running GE at the time. So Six Sigma was the mantra, and we, being one of the 300 largest suppliers to GE gas turbine, were invited to participate in Six Sigma. So in that case, I participated as a supplier, and it was really primarily, as you know, for cost reduction. So they took out a tremendous amount of cost in the supply base. I think our prices dropped close to 30% over a 3 or 4 year period. Fortunately, we had some pretty healthy margins going in. So in that case, for me, the continuous improvement initiative was almost exclusively, all right, let's find ways to take cost out of the business and give it back to the customer.
It's super interesting. There's a couple of things in there I find particularly juicy. One of them is that there was some exposure to this thing we call lean as a vendor, as a supplier to another company. That's a pattern that I see, and I think it's also a model for people that are pushing, or responsible for building a lean or a CI or OpEx program inside of an organization, to realize at some point you do need to improve your suppliers. One thing I'm interested in picking up in this podcast are just some of the lessons learned there. So when you get introduced to that as a supplier, are there some things that you feel like they did well, or some things that you feel like they didn't do well in that experience?
Yeah, I think in retrospect, it was all about staying alive as a supplier to General Electric. So we didn't have any intellectual property. We were making product to their drawings, and so they were our exclusive customer. So unfortunately, the incentive to do it was to remain a General Electric supplier. And I think that came through loud and clear. So, here's what we need. We need a 10% price reduction. Here's a tool set you can use to help achieve that price reduction. So my experience at John Deere was 100% positive. My experience as a supplier to a company pushing the Six Sigma initiative was not nearly as positive. It ended up being a positive outcome, but it was not favorable. And I've been on both ends of that coin, or both sides of the coin. I've been the leader in a large organization asking suppliers to use OpEx and continuous improvement, and I've also been that supplier being asked to do those things. So I think my next stop in my journey might answer some additional questions. So I spent time at this small company, and then I was offered a general management role with an aerospace and defense company in North Carolina. And so I moved to that role, and I believed that we were doing well, and I was told we were doing well financially. Found out we were losing money, and we were losing money by virtue of my predecessor having signed on to some contracts with Boeing and others that were underwater, in quotes, selling product at less than our manufacturing cost. So in that case, I called upon my Lean Six Sigma skill set, and we formed manufacturing cells and basically assigned many general managers who used those cells to run their part of the business. And so we weren't trying to achieve single piece flow. We were just trying to reduce our manufacturing costs so we could become more competitive, and basically distributing responsibility through the organization to others. And so in that case, it was a hugely positive outcome. We were able to turn the business around. We started making money. And as a result of a number of things, I got promoted to a role that allowed me to be vice president with multiple divisions for which I was responsible. As a supplier there, we were doing work for people like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and so forth. And I remember that at that point in time, they had people who were in the Lean camp and people who were in the Six Sigma camp. They were almost fighting for internal resources. And so they would come in and ask or require us to do certain things, sometimes in competition with the other group. And so it was kind of humorous to see that over the next few years, it melded into more of a combined portfolio or a combined tool set. I know that a lot of folks are not in favor of Six Sigma, and I went through the Lean Six Sigma Black Belt program at that point in time. By that point, I was a chief operating officer, and I did it really because I wanted to know more about the process and the approach. So our approach that we evolved to was 95% Lean, 5% Six Sigma when we had some lingering quality issues. So for me, it's like a tool set that we reach into, and we use the tool or the approach that's most applicable to the situation at hand. The other thing that I learned there and we did there was we were doing FS, but we started to employ TPM. And so we went from cleaning our machines and doing a better job of organizing the cells. And at this point, the cell leaders were owning this process. And then we started to do some TPM work. And a few of the people, it's kind of like a pull system, which I found is the most effective way to introduce any of these things. So we introduced it in the area that we thought it would work best. It worked amazingly well to the point that the cell leaders and the operators were treating the machines like they're cars. So they would wash and wax the car. If it was left untidy on third shift, they'd leave a note saying, hey, you didn't, clean up XYZ. So it worked really well, and then it flowed through the facility. Not all cells, but most of the cells picked it up. And so that helped immeasurably with regard to just preventive maintenance and making sure that we knew the condition of the machines.
One thing that I find is an interesting topic is just the language that's used in this umbrella of business improvement or continuous improvement or operational excellence. You touched on a few of the acronyms there, TPM and 5S. How do you explain that to somebody who's, maybe asking you what you do for a living?
Yeah, I don't consider myself to be a OpEx or CI expert. What I do is really, since I was in my late 20s, I've been either in a general management role or above. So I use those tools and techniques, or more accurately, I have people who have skills in those techniques help us improve the business. So let me move to the next step, because I think this will help answer some of those questions. So I ended up leaving that aerospace and defense company, but not before I kind of went through a turbulent period of time. So I'll explain that now. And this is what I wrote one of my books about. So we were fairly acquisitive. We had acquired some businesses, some international. And my job as EVP, Chief Operating Officer, was to integrate those businesses and absorb them into our company. And most importantly, it was to have them adopt our pretty aggressive approach to return on invested capital and top-line CAGR growth. So we would have a 3-year objective with a matrix, and the y-axis was top-line CAGR, the x-axis was return on invested capital, and my mission and the general manager's missions, who ran the P&Ls, was to get into that northeast quadrant. So pretty aggressive percentages on both axes. So I remember I was in Schaffhausen, Switzerland. I was talking to the managing director of the business we had acquired, and I was explaining our aggressive approach with regard to return on invested capital. And I think we were looking at for 15%. He had been achieving about 3%, and I was telling him how we were going to use tools like Lean Six Sigma and so forth to improve it. So he was nodding politely. I knew he was going to do none of it when I left. So I went back to Zurich, and I flew home, and on the airplane, I literally on a napkin, I'm charting out our deployment strategy. I didn't know even what to call it at the time, but so we were using balanced scorecard to deploy strategy fairly effectively. I hadn't discovered Hoshin at that point. I was a Lean Six Sigma black belt, and we had some pretty good folks throughout the organization doing some good work. But this resistance to change thing, I couldn't even identify. I couldn't name it. I just knew everywhere I went, we were facing it. And a lot of it was the culture of these organizations was not aligned with ours, and really, honestly, never would be. And so I got back home and I talked to our VP of HR, a gentleman by the name of Marcel, and I explained the problem, and he said, what we need is organizational change management, OCM. So I immediately dismissed it because it felt and sounded too squishy and much like kumbaya. And I was an analytical, data-oriented guy, an engineer with an MBA, and so I was looking for data and numbers. Well, I was wrong. And when I researched it, I found out at the time that GE was doing something called Change Acceleration Process, CAP, with a lot of really very good results. And I did more research, and I found out that there was a company in Boulder, Colorado by the name of ProSci that had been doing, was founded by a gentleman, Jeff Hyatt from Bell Labs, doing research and publishing reports every 2 years on change management. And so I went out to meet Jeff. I also met a lady in Chicago by the name of Janine LaMarche, who had been doing change management work for a long time. Learned a lot about it, came back and met with my boss, the CEO, and we were in his office. I said, hey, Jared, as you know, we're doing a pretty good job of deploying strategy with Balanced Scorecard. We're using Lean Six Sigma with some pretty good impact in places, but we don't have an approach to address change management or resistance to change. And so I said, I found an approach and a technique. It's very data-oriented. I'd like to build it into our approach. And I remember Jared holding up his hand, signaling me to stop. And he said, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I have a change management approach that works very well. And I said, what's that? And he put his foot up on his conference table and pointed to, and he said, 11E. If they don't want to do it, I kick them in the butt. And so he and I laughed. But it was true. That was his change management approach, because I'd been on the receiving end of it before. But that doesn't work anywhere, but it certainly doesn't work very well when you're trying to deal with somebody in Schaffhausen, Switzerland. So George and I didn't last that much longer with that organization. I'd been there about 7 years, and so I ended up leaving, and I couldn't work in the industry for 18 months, or I'd forfeit a bunch of good stuff. So I went into consulting, and guess what I went into consulting doing? Change management. I then went into training with Janine LaMarche and worked with her for a while, side by side. And so I intended to do it for 18 months, but I ended up doing it for about 3.5 years. And so I went from being a P&L leader in an aerospace and defense organization, where the F word means what you think the F word might mean, and went into the other side, the dark side, with the organizational development people, dealing with change management, where I was the only P&L speaking person on the team. Teamed up with a bunch of people where the F word meant feelings. So go into a group of 20 master black belts and start talking about feelings, and it's like you're throwing snakes on the floor. They're squirming around. They don't know how to deal with it. And so I was the one that would calm them down and say, wait a minute, this is a data-oriented approach, and we're going to talk about how we're going to build this into DMAIC. So I was the connection point who understood change management, but could also speak to the left brain analytical folks.
I think that's such a good insight there about combining the left and the right brain, I guess you'd say, of this approach. Let me ask you a couple of pointed questions here. So is Lean a tool, a program, an initiative, a strategy, a culture, or something else?
Yeah, so let me explain that. So my feelings about this have evolved over the years. So John Deere, and I started doing work in that area and then learned more about it. I thought that this is the way to save U.S. manufacturing. And if only we could get the leaders of the companies to adopt this stuff, then this was the salvation, right? I've become jaded over the years because I was one of those leaders of the organization, and I know that there's only a couple special cases where that will work, at least in the United States. One is I own the business, and I'm planning to be here a long time, and I can dictate that we're going to use this thing called Lean and describe it however you want, and we're going to stick with it regardless of what the CFO says, because I pay the CFO. The other example is, might be a bad example, but the other example is Jack Welch, where you got somebody who's powerful enough and far-sighted enough where they can create an initiative that, regardless of what the board says, regardless of what the executives say, they're going to see it through. And so other than those two examples, and there aren't very many in the corporate world where somebody's got enough power and somebody's got enough longevity to maintain it, what I see is it's kind of in the middle ground. So on the one end of the spectrum, you've got the people who believe it's a near religion, and we need to adopt an approach and a philosophy and a culture and so forth that's aligned with that you might see in Toyota. And the other end of the spectrum, you've got people possibly in the private equity world who see this as a tool to dramatically increase EBITDA at the sacrifice of people's jobs and so forth. I'm in the middle ground where I see it as an approach that should be used to enable the business's strategy. It should not be the business's strategy. I've seen some people who almost believe that Lean is their strategy, and I don't think that works.
That's a super great foothold for me to dive into this question of the difference between, let's say, a strategy and a tactic. It sounds like you've got some feelings about that concept. Like, Can you maybe give us an example of a strategic choice that Lean might be in support of that one of these companies would make?
Yeah, so let me move to Hoshin for a minute because I told you that earlier in my career we're using balanced scorecard to deploy strategy, and I participated in strategic planning sessions in small companies, medium size, very large organizations. And what I found is we'd go off site, we'd spend a lot of time doing a lot of good work, we'd develop the strategy and the 5-year plan, create a long list of strategic initiatives, and each function had to have their list, right? So we would come away with dozens of strategic initiatives, and then we'd have a binder that would show up at some point in time, and we'd have it on our bookshelf. And then next year we'd do the same thing, and we would review the strategic initiatives and find that very few had been completed. So we killed some off, added some new ones, kept some going. So the whole strategy process for me was not a productive exercise. And so when I discovered Hoshin Kanri, a light bulb went off, and I said, this is a process that I can get my arms around, and it's linked to Lean. Its genesis is in that world. So it's easier to sell to fellow executives, and you can make it simple enough that you can actually not only formulate or reformulate strategy, but you can deploy it in large organizations, and small organizations don't even really need that step. And then you can execute it using tools like Lean Six Sigma and other whatever tool is, probably coupled with organizational change management in both cases. So that's the tool sets that I use as a leader. And I use, right now I'm in 3 interim fractional executive roles, and the roles I'm using in those positions are Hoshin Kanri to help the organization formulate strategy, because a lot of small, medium-sized companies, they might have a 3 to 5 year financial plan, but they really don't have a strategy. And so help them kind of think through what is the strategy, then coming out of all that, looking at their current state, their desired future state, what are the biggest gaps, and from that, what are their strategic objectives? So what is that small set of strategic objectives, or they could be called Hoshins, depending on the organization. Some don't want to use that vernacular. And those are the results of the strategy session that we need to execute. And so then the linkage is, right, we've got a strategic objective. We need to reduce or improve our quality by 20% in division X, let's say. We've got a major quality issue there. Let's develop projects and initiatives in support of that strategic objective, and let's report out on it, and let's use the catch-ball process if it fits the organization. If the X matrix doesn't quite fit, let's use the balanced scorecard format to explain how we're deploying it out. So use sensible tools and approaches to deploy strategy, and then repeat the process. So next year, let's go back and look, where are we? Do we need to change direction at all? Do we need to eliminate one strategic objective and add another?
So, Randy, I know that you wrote a book, The Basics of Hoshin Kanri, and it's wonderful to talk to the person who wrote the book literally on Hoshin, because it's such a big topic, and I see so many people trying it, and I see it done with variations of success. Tell me, why did you write that book?
So I started my individual independent consulting organization about 20 years ago. And a friend of mine was also in a similar role, and he said, you need to write a book. And I said, why is that? And he said, you can use it as a business card. You can hand it to a potential client. They'll never read it, but they won't throw it away. Where with a business card, they'll probably throw it away or stick it in a file somewhere or drawer, and never see it again. So I took his advice, and I wrote a couple chapters, and it was about strategy, deployment, successes, and failures. Well, a book publisher saw it, posted on the internet. He said, we like your writing style. If you fine-tune it to talk about Hoshin Kanri, we'll publish it. So I had intended to self-publish, so I said, absolutely. So I had used Hoshin before. I was by no means an expert, but I had used it. I interviewed around 100 people, maybe more, about their successes and failures and critical success factors and so forth. And then, so the book explains the process in a pretty simple fashion. It starts with, how would you apply Hoshin Kanri to your personal life? Then it's, how would you apply Hoshin Kanri to an organization? And then the latter part of the book is about Q&A with all these experts. What did you find that worked best? What did you find that didn't work? All those types of things.
So who did you write that book for? Who is the ideal reader of the book?
What I found is the ideal reader is the small to medium size company owner or executive, because it provides a format for them to follow in working strategy and strategy execution. It's also for the lean leader, the CI leader, because in most organizations, you've got the person doing the CI work down at the ground. The executive has almost no engagement in those activities other than maybe some report out sessions. And so really Hoshin, I think, is the linkage to the executive branch, because if you schedule a meeting that has strategy in the title, all the VPs want to attend, right? You schedule a meeting about lean, whatever, they won't show up. So Hoshin is really their role in an organization where it's a lean approach, a lean tool that they can participate in, and they can be involved in the catchball process. They can certainly be involved in helping to identify the strategic objectives for the organization. They're involved in several facets of that. That's where I see like leader standard work, and even I've been on so many Gemba walks where the people feel like they have to do it. They participate but not fully engage. They don't really want to do it. It's not part of their culture. Where Hoshin is something that helps them engage in strategy with the business and helps connect the people doing strategy execution with the people who are formulating strategy.
I was able to see, the first 20 pages or so. And you mentioned something about the comparison between a personal, I think you used the word mission statement in the book. How does a company know if they actually have a strategy or if they just have a long list of goals and maybe should go back to the drawing board?
Yeah, I would even go to an additional extreme where there are companies that don't even have a long list of goals. They have a financial plan with financial targets. So that's at one end of the spectrum. In the middle of a long list of goals, and I've encountered those companies. I was working with one a couple years ago, a very large organization I won't name because it would embarrass them. They had close to 70-some goals, strategic objectives. They were not linked in any way that I could see, and some of them were almost undoing some of the work that some of the other initiatives were doing, and so there was very little commonality, there was very little alignment between those initiatives. And so I guess I would just start the process that I advocate might explain or might help answer the question. So I work with organizations and we start with just understanding, what's working through SWOT and what's your competitive advantage as a business. And then we talk about what is your mission and what are your values. And so then we begin to look at, okay, understanding all of that, let's define your current state. And we define their current state pretty succinctly in terms of 5 facets. So it's structure, which has to do with their geography, their systems they're using, the organizational structure. It's process, which is the processes they use to do the work. It's people, which is about people competencies, so skills, abilities. And then it's culture, which is about behaviors, beliefs, rules, written and unwritten. And we capture those things. So I'm working with an organization right now, and one of my questions for them is, hey, give me your 3 unwritten rules here. What does it take to succeed in this organization? And then the 5th one is about metrics. Just what's important, what are you measuring now, and how are you doing? So then we zoom out and we go to vision, and we say, where do you want to be in X years? You'll never get there, but what star are you shooting for? It doesn't have to be a North Star, just where are you headed? Once we understand that, then we say, what's your desired future state in X years? Could be 3 years, could be 5 years. And then we look at their current state and their desired future state, and we say, where are their biggest gaps? So it might be in culture, it might be in processes, it might be in structure, it might be in people skills and competencies and so forth. And by the way, what are the metrics you want to be using in that time frame, and what are your targets? And so then we say, what are your biggest gaps? And then we use some tools to prioritize those gaps, and those become their strategic objectives. So it's, who are you now? Where do you want to be? And then what are the biggest gaps that are preventing you from getting there? And then it's almost like stepping stones. So envision current state today, desired future state might be 5 years out, and we might have a stepping stone a year from now. So what's your desired future state a year from now? And probably most importantly, how do we know when we get there? What are the metrics? What are the targets so we can declare success or not? But the key to all of that, after talking to 100 people, and the one key takeaway from the book for me is you can't have 75 strategic objectives, because 75 strategic objectives become hundreds and hundreds of projects and initiatives, and none of them get done. And so the advice from everyone I talked to who was successful said, limit it to 1, 2, or 3 big things you're trying to do. You might change that next year or change directionally a little bit, but don't have dozens. And a boss of mine from years ago who had never heard of Hoshin or any of these things always equated it to the burners on a stove. So he said, you've got 4 pots boiling. Don't put another one on until you take one off. Whether it's done or not, you may decide. You don't have too many things cooking at the same time because it never works.
I think that's an interesting tie-in there potentially to, the idea of Kanban and maximum amount of work in process, right? I had a mentor one time that asked me for my priorities, and I think I gave him a list of 7 things, and his retort was like, so really what that is a list of 1 thing you're doing and 6 things that you're not doing, which is the priority.
Yeah. I'm sure you've read Goldrat's books, but I had the opportunity to talk to Goldrat's daughter about a year ago, and she wrote a book about applying his concept to project management, and that's basically the conclusion is people think they're doing well when they're multitasking, moving back and forth between projects, but they've proven that it's a very ineffective way of doing work.
Is that the Rules of Flow book? So good. I got halfway through that and immediately sent it to everybody in the company. I was like, you gotta listen to this. It's so good. You could take any one of the tools, the acronyms that you talked about, the 5S, the TOC, the TQM, the TPM, the Hoshin, all these things. And there's so many layers to it. You might describe it as like an onion or something, where when you think you understand it, you realize that there's so many more layers beyond what you even thought existed to many of these things, which I personally have gone back and forth or waffled a number of times just trying to describe this industry that I'm in, whether it's continuous improvement or operational excellence or lean. And I've landed on this idea of it's just business improvement, because I think the concept that everybody intuitively understands that businesses need to get better. If you're going to go into your boss and you're going to ask for a raise, there's an assumption that the work that you've done is better than it was previously, and hence you're worth more money. And I think when people understand and think about their careers like a business, everybody who's asking for a raise is essentially asking for a price increase from their customer. And this is one of the hot topics in lean is, do you focus on cost savings or hard savings or benefits, or do you focus on the activities? And I think that's one of those where it's probably circular. What do you advise people on when they're looking to come up with like an ROI for an initiative or a program like this?
Yeah, I think if I'm working for that private business owner who is saying, let's use this approach, come hell or high water, I don't care about it. If I'm working for Jack Welch, I don't care about it. If I'm working for 99% of the CEOs in the United States, at least, and probably the world, and the CFO who's asking the question every quarter as they have of me, then you have to consider it, because you've got, take organizations now, a lot of them are in downsizing modes. And so you sit in a room with the CHRO and the CEO and a couple other people, the CFO, and you're trying to figure out how to take millions of dollars of cost out. And typically people is the number one item on the Pareto chart with regard to cost, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we eliminate heads? I mean, that's always the question. So the people who are doing value-added work are set aside. The people who are in functions that cannot be spared, supposedly, are set aside. And you're left with people in project management functions, people in, those functions that are considered discretionary. Well, unfortunately, CI in most organizations is considered discretionary. The exception is if you've been able to prove to the CFO who only cares about ROI, that this group of 15 or 20 people are not only paying for themselves, but they're also contributing to the bottom line, then those jobs are spared. And so it's almost like a necessity in some organizations to consider it. I've seen a lot of traffic on LinkedIn about, it shouldn't be considered, and I've engaged in some of those arguments, but I think, unfortunately, I think it's necessary depending on the environment within which you work.
I like that you mentioned the balanced scorecard background that you have, because I think that there's some lessons in balanced scorecard that can exist for even a CI program. Of course, not everything that you do is going to have hard savings tied to it, but I can think of numerous examples of people that I've talked to in the industry who were let go because they worked for a company that wasn't tracking any kind of hard savings. And like you said, somebody came in and said, what's this shared service? What's this support function? Let's cut that. And they're out the door. So is there maybe some advice? I mean, you kind of hinted at that, but how might somebody set a target even if their company doesn't have a hard savings target?
I think back in the early days of belts when no one really knew what the role consisted of, and so that was the thinking is if that person costs $150,000, $200,000 a year all in with benefits, let's make sure they're have hard savings of at least that much, knowing that there are probably soft savings that go far beyond that. I think that's probably not a bad rule of thumb to start with, especially with people who are doing it for the first time. But there are too many people out there doing it for the first time. Unfortunately, people are in their fourth, fifth, sixth wave of CI, and they're just trying to take a different cut at it. With regard to the balanced scorecard, what I found is, that kind of forces you to think of your objectives in different ways. So they're not all financial. It causes you to kind of use a whole brain approach to think about objectives. So I think about that when working through a Hoshin exercise is just, when we look at the current state versus where we're trying to go, that's the reason for the structure, process, people, culture, metrics, is it forces you to think about what is the culture of the organization today. And so today we've got, for example, low people engagement, right? And we want to have our employees engaged and involved and so forth in the future. Well, you can measure that through surveys and so forth, but how do you dollarize it? It's hard to put an ROI around that. So that's one of those things where I've worked initiatives to change aspects of culture before, and you can measure where we are now versus where we are then. But if someone asked for an ROI, it would be hard, and it would be hard to assign a hard savings to it as well.
I'm curious, balanced scorecard is something I'm super interested in. Spend a lot of time doing it. I tend to think about a lot of goals in that way. The financial perspective, and just by the way, I want to make sure and pick up on it. When we share acronyms, I try to explain what they are, like TOC, theory of constraints, TQM, total quality management, TPM, total preventive maintenance. Is that the same TPM that you're thinking?
There's several terms. One's total preventive maintenance, total productive maintenance. There's several, but the idea is, in my mind, it's improve the condition of the machine. I think Millikan's a perfect example of using a technique where it's to maintain the condition of the machine, and you do that by having the operator act as really, in effect, an owner. So they're treating it as if it's their own automobile, and then the people doing the predictive, preventive, periodic maintenance are working in tandem with them, because in some organizations you've almost got production and the maintenance team in competition, where production's going to run it as long as they can until it breaks, and then they call maintenance to come in and fix it, as opposed to, hey, this thing's making a noise I haven't heard before, please look at it. So it's a collective effort where these people are working together to maintain the machine. And the reason I mentioned Millikan is I walked into one of their factories one time, and the room, they were doing weaving, I believe, and the room had maybe 100 machines in it, CNC machines, and a few operators and a few attendants, and all the andon lights were green. And so I said, wow, this is really impressive. And I said, how old are those machines? And they were 40 years old. So they kept them in such condition that their maintenance program was just absolutely amazing. So, TPM for me, that's the exemplar, is treat your machines as if you own them personally and work together collectively to make sure that they they produce a quality product. Back to the OEE as a measure, it's a good way to measure, are the machines producing a quality product and doing it effectively.
I saw a good analogy for OEE as, is it the right metric or not? When somebody said, hey, let's say you just bought a new family car and it was a super expensive car and you're super proud of it. Like, are you trying to maximize the miles on that car, or are you trying to extend the life? I thought that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about the wrong metric for the wrong piece of equipment.
Yep. No, I think the application for OEE is around a bottleneck resource. And I've had arguments and discussions on LinkedIn about this. And it's my personal opinion, but that's where, for me, it's most effective.
Absolutely.
To apply it otherwise, I don't understand the advantage.
Yeah, there's so many good paradox in this world of, like, keep things the same. You example of that 40-year-old CNC equipment. Like, are we operating, I kind of think of it as like manager versus leader mentality. Like, keep things the same as in this manager mode versus leader, like make things better, improve. And I find that there's a lot of this, like, tension between making things better, creating some version of variation versus keeping things the same.
I asked them that very question, and I thought their response was interesting, where I said, why have you not evolved to the next generation of equipment? And they said there hasn't been enough of a leap in productivity for us to make those tens of millions of dollars of investment. Now, once they reach that stage, then they would start trading out their equipment for the next generation. But at this point, they had the logistics, they had the spare parts, they were doing their own, repair and overhaul on these machines by this time. And so there was not a large incentive until there was a big leap in technology to move to the next generation of equipment.
There's a lesson in there that resonates with me. I'm in the software world, of course. And in software, every time you come across a problem, some developer somewhere wants to just automate that problem. Like, hey, here's something that I spend 15 minutes on once a year. We could spend 3 months writing software to save you that 15 minutes once a year. And in realizing that your ROI is like 67 years later, you've paid for that effort. So I think this idea of business improvement is so much broader than any one tool. I want to come back to the balanced scorecard a little bit. This is one that I think about a lot, just for anybody's benefit. Balanced scorecard, you've essentially got 4 perspectives. You've got a financial perspective. You've got a customer's perspective. So let's say that, maybe my financial metrics maybe at the top level are revenue or profit or cost, some very hard, numerical thing. A customer metric, maybe it's,
on-time delivery.
Yeah, on-time delivery, something like that. Let's get into the lower 2 levels of the balanced scorecard, like internal business process. That's how I tend to think of it. What are some metrics that somebody might set goals around in that layer of the balanced scorecard?
Yeah, I think it depends on the business, but like in aerospace and defense, you're typically looking at safety, you're looking at quality, internal process quality, and looking at velocity. So how fast are we moving materials through the process? Those would be 3, and then productivity might be another one. So, if you've seen the SQDIP boards, or typically SQD or universal, and then pick a letter after that, but it tends to be safety, quality, and delivery are on-time delivery, and then the last 2 have to do with cost and velocity. For me, those are kind of the key measures. And the company I visited just yesterday, I came away and I'm going to send them a report, and I'm going to have a red, yellow, green score on those SQDIP assessment for their business, just at a high level, just to let them know where I think they have some opportunity.
So let's talk about that 4th perspective on the balanced scorecard. This is the one that I sometimes have the hardest time with, I guess I might say. Like, whether you describe it as learning and growth or culture, capability, people, how would you describe that 4th perspective on balanced scorecard? How do you see that best implemented in strategic planning?
I think of it as being that people culture block that I was mentioning. And so most organizations, if you define the current state, they've got some gaps in terms of people skills and competencies, or they have gaps in terms of they don't have the right people in certain parts of the organization. And so the desired future state speaks to what gaps are most important for us to fill. And then likewise, culture around, what are the behaviors, what are the beliefs we're seeing, what are the rules, written or unwritten, and so this exercise I'm doing with one organization now, we're capturing the current state beliefs. What are the 3 unwritten rules here? And I'm sure we'll find some things that are alarming to the CEO, where people think this is what you have to do to be successful here. And so part of that exercise is, let's make sure we communicate that if you think belief X will allow you to be promoted here, that's counter to what our values are and what we're doing. What we want to do is make sure you understand that these are the beliefs we're trying to instill in everyone and the values we're trying to adhere to. And so for me, that's the softer part of it, is both skills, competencies, and then behaviors, beliefs, and unwritten rules that can be moved. And they can be moved through change management. It's like anything else. Are you familiar with the ADKAR acronym?
Elaborate on that. I don't know.
So very quickly, think of it as a series of hurdles we're trying to cross. And so the first hurdle is an A, it's awareness. So who's your favorite sports team?
Let's say the Utah Hockey Club.
So who's the nemesis?
The nemesis, gosh, probably going to be the Vancouver Canucks this year, because they're fighting for the playoff spot.
So what if I told you I want you to wear a Vancouver hat for the rest of the year, whenever you're on?
That'd be painful.
So what if I told you that the reason we want to do that is we've got a hugely important client that's a Canuck fan, and if you wear a hat, then they will contribute $25,000 a month to your organization.
I don't know. I really have to swallow some pride to do that.
So the A is awareness. I'm trying to explain the business case. What's the why to change? Yeah. The D is desire. What's the desire for you to personally engage? So what's the WIFM? And so then the K is knowledge. And so think of it also like an ERP implementation, right? So what do most companies do when they want to implement ERP or lean? It doesn't really matter. They put people in training classes. So they're in the class. They have no awareness of why they're there. They have no desire to be there. So how much soaks into their brain? Probably not very much. So the better way to do it is you make sure you have awareness, then you have desire, and then you can impart knowledge. And then the next letter is A, and that stands for ability. So think about when you learn to parallel park a car. So it's not easy, right? I mean, you can watch your parents do it, you can read a book, you can watch a video. Until you're behind the wheel trying to parallel park that car, you cannot develop the ability. So the gap between knowledge and ability is sometimes larger than in other cases. And then the R in ADKAR stands for reinforcement. So it's like control and DMAIC. Once you get them to the new desired future state, how do you keep them there? So use the ERP system, don't use your spreadsheets and so forth. So that's, whether it's a cultural change or a system change, or it doesn't really matter. I found that using ADKAR either overtly or covertly helps people move through that process.
That's awesome. You talk about this word culture. I have a particular interest in culture generally. It sounds like you have a bit of a model or a framework, a way of thinking about or identifying culture. Is that an accurate way to describe how you think about culture?
This is one of the things I learned from Janine LaMarche many years ago. People think of culture as being very squishy, and Janine had a methodology that allowed her to define culture. And so it was defined literally in terms of behaviors, beliefs, rules written and unwritten. And you capture what is it today, and then you talk about, okay, what aspects of the culture do we want to retain, and what do we think we want to change? And then you just go through an organizational change management process to change those things. And it works 99% of the time. But it starts with defining it very carefully, so that, because it could be different in different parts of an organization. So sometimes at a high level, the culture is the same, but when you dive into geographies or departments, especially companies that have been acquired, will have an entirely different culture. So Danaher is a good example. Legacy Danaher has got a culture that supports lean. Some of their bolt-on businesses do not. And so that's been one of the struggles that they've been working on.
That's such an interesting topic on culture. I have a simple definition I really like, which is just the way we do things around here. Very simple and concise. Are there any behavior patterns? I like this term rituals, as like patterns of significance, behavior patterns of significance, that if you're going in and working with a company as a culture, that you might either look for in the form of an audit, like, are you doing this, or we should start doing this? Is there a certain set of behavior patterns that come to mind that you think of?
Yeah, so when I start working with a client, what I try to do is get a picture of the overall organization around structure, process, people, skills, and so forth, and culture. And then I talk to the company or the client or the CEO about, here's what I found with regard to culture. Which aspects do you want to retain and which aspects would you like to change? Something I learned many, many years ago is you can't change culture in isolation. So if you're going to try to change the culture, you also probably need to look at changing aspects of the organizational structure, or maybe some of the people in the organization, or potentially the processes that are being used. And metrics are very important as well, right? Because metrics will support either through carrot and stick some behaviors and some culture that exists today. So I think of it as culture is one aspect of the entire organization. I don't go into an organization looking for some ways to change the culture, because if the existing culture supports the business and the leadership likes it that way, then I'm not going to advocate a change.
Excellent. Are there, maybe this is part of what you just answered, are there any, I'll just use the word core values, and I realize that a lot of people can describe similar concepts with different words, but is there a common set of core values that you look for, maybe even in working with potential companies to see if there's a good fit, or to see if there's a foundation for success? Anything that comes to mind in the concept of core values?
Yeah, personally, what I found many years ago, the Shingo foundational principles are those that resonate with me, and it's probably because that's who I think I am when I'm on my best day, right? So, try to treat everyone with respect, regardless of whether it's the chairman of the board or they're emptying your trash can, and act with humility. Because I've worked around so many executives whose ego is the size of Connecticut. I tried not to be that way. But growing up in a small town in Iowa, it's easy.
Yeah, that's great. Those are I can have a lot of appreciation for those. I probably resonate with those core values to some degree. That's excellent. One thing that's super hot topic right now is AI, and how AI is going to, change the world. I have a take on this about, the people involved in change management are probably going to be around. The people that are just waiting for their role to be changed, could be at risk. I'm sure you've probably thought about AI. Do you have any thoughts or maybe inspiring words for people in change management or continuous improvement or these disciplines on how to think about job security, where the future's going with things like AI?
Yeah, I think of AI as an enabler if you look at it the right way. So you could either be afraid of it and try to avoid it, or you can learn how to take advantage of it and make use of it in your job. And that's really what I do now. So I use AI to help me in areas where it can do some of the grunt work for me that I might have spent more time doing in the past. So it's a major revolutionary step, but I think of it a little bit like the computer. I'm old enough to remember before we had spreadsheets, right? So the first time I had to add a column of numbers, I had a paper and a pencil and a calculator, and then along came Lotus 1, 2, 3, and then Excel and so forth. And so it was a huge productivity boost. It was a way to do the work differently. Some people didn't want to do it. They stuck with the old way, and they got left behind. So I just see it as a way to enhance what we're doing, do it better, do it faster. Obviously, AI has access to information none of the rest of us have or could have. So I think it's a fantastic thing, and for regardless of your role, really, whether it's continuous improvement or operational excellence.
Is there something that, as you look back on your career, that you were involved in where maybe when you first did it, you thought, gosh, I'm not really sure why I'm being asked to do this, or I don't see how this is going to help, but maybe towards the end you figured out, like, wow, I really learned a lot from this lesson? Is there an experience that comes to mind like that?
I think most of the things I got involved in my career, the way my brain works is I always zoom out and I look at the big picture, and then I drill down to understand it better. And so I have to think back of the career decisions I've made and the path I've followed, I don't know that I would have changed direction, because for me, each one of those things was kind of complementary. It may have been a sideways step for a while, and I wasn't exactly sure why I should pursue that, but the opportunity presented itself. So I'll use the example of, I was a P&L leader running a fairly large organization, and I took a step into organizational change management. But I did it because I was very interested in it. I knew very little about it. I knew it was going to be complementary to my career once I got back into industry again, and it was. And so that's probably the best example in my career, is I took a step that a lot of people wouldn't take because they could view it as being career damaging. And it's been probably the best decision I made, because I approach every problem now with this element of, especially on transformations, with this element of, are you familiar with the E equal QA, Q times A equation?
No, tell us about that.
So this came from, I think, General Electric many years ago, but I think about this on every transformation I'm working. So E stands for effectiveness of the overall success of the change effort. Q stands for the quality of the solution, so how strong or how technically sound is the solution, whether it's a process, system, strategy. And A is the acceptance, so the buy-in, the commitment, the adoption. So no matter how good the quality of the solution is, if it's not adopted, then the effectiveness is low, right? Conversely, a lot of adoption to an ineffective, low-quality solution results in low effectiveness. So you've got to have both. You've got to have a good change, and you've got to have adoption of that good change. So many people are focused on the technical aspects of the solution, the project, and so forth. Not enough people, especially in leadership, are thinking about adoption, because we've got to adopt this new thing, and then more importantly, we've got to sustain it once it's adopted. And so that's in the back of my mind. Every one of these things that I'm talking to people about, they want to change X. Well, how are we going to change it and get people to adopt, and then how are we going to keep them there once they're using that new process, that new tool? I think the time I spent in the organizational development world, it's helped me think about things in those terms.
Excellent. Yeah, the sustainment topic is, whether it's an entire lean program, things come in hot and heavy, a lot of change happens, and then people just tend to drop whatever it is. Sustaining those changes and maintaining those through some version of standard work is such a...
I was talking to an executive with a very large international company just last week, and his lament was with regard to lean. He said, we move forward and then we fall back, and then we move forward and then we fall back. And he said, we've never, ever been able to sustain the gains, and they were looking for a new way to go about it. And this is a, probably $120 million or $120 billion organization, and it's a very, very common problem.
I think trying to make continuous improvement more continuous is
absolutely
part of what we need to do. Well, hey, Randy, we really appreciate you joining us here on the podcast today. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you or follow up with you or follow you, maybe buy your books or listen to your podcast, is there any place that we should send them?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got close to 20,000 connections on LinkedIn, so I love to connect. As long as you're not trying to sell me insurance, I'll be happy to connect with you. And I post a lot, and please communicate with me there. I also have a website. It's my last name, KestersonGroup.com. You can find me. You can see what I do, what I've done, and be happy to talk to you if you have any questions about OPEX, CI, Lean, change management, Hoshin Kanri. Buy my book, because my mother bought one, Keith bought one, and so you can be the third customer.
This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire. KPI Fire is continuous improvement software. KPI Fire helps you align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people, all in one powerful software platform. So whether you're leading a team or transforming an entire organization, KPI Fire is your partner in achieving breakthrough results. Learn more at KPIFire.com. Thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. We appreciate your time and your experience. If you'd like to suggest a guest, ask a question, or give us any ideas for future episodes, you can reach out to me, Keith C. Norris, on LinkedIn. And this concludes our episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on the socials and share this podcast with friends, colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcast, and until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.